So this is just a small rant that I had in concern to something that I saw very recently. The other day I was on Twitter and I ended up seeing a poll that was put out by Maxime Bernier, and this actually video doesn't have anything to do with Maxime Bernier really. But one thing that the poll he ended up putting out had to do with immigration, right? So he has in the past proposed 250,000 immigrants every year, which is pretty much what it's been like for a long time. For years and years and years, even under Harper, we were having immigration at about this level. Trudeau has increased it to over 300,000 per year, and they still want to increase it further. They're looking at 350,000 every year. There's even been talks of 1 million Canadians over 3 years. And there's even been talks of, by the year 2100, they want to have the Canadian population at 100 million. So the only way to really achieve this is going to be through mass migration. Now, so this is what he ended up putting out. So he put out a few different options, 300,000, 250,000, and the last option on there was 0 to 100,000, right? And overwhelmingly, people were sitting at the 0 to 100,000 margin. I think it was something about 75% of the people ended up voting for this. And then there was a comment that was made by Manny Ottawa, also known as Manny Montenegrino. I'm not doxing him. His name is publicly available. He's a lawyer, so his name is out there. And he got into a bit of a Twitter spat with Bill Tufts. Now, Bill Tufts has been on my podcast before. I spoke to him a few months ago when we were discussing the UN Global Compact for Migration, and immigration has been one of those things that Bill Tufts has talked about a lot. So Manny ended up getting into it with Bill because he had a problem with this number, the one that most people end up talking about, and he tried to use it as a form of the PPC is full of bigots because they chose the 0 to 100,000. Now, Manny also stated in this exchange that he would choose an immigration number about 275,000 people per year. The thing is that I had a big problem with this is when he talked about how the PPC is full of bigots because they chose this number. So people who are concerned with the current levels of immigration are bigots now simply because they want to have this conversation. And this is something that Manny ended up saying. He said that he wanted to have a conversation about immigration, and then literally in the same tweet, calls the people bigots because they chose this number. Now, first things first, 0 to 100,000 is a huge margin, a very huge margin. So people who wanted lower immigration, who want 100,000, maybe 75,000 or 50,000, would be forced to choose this number. That doesn't mean that they absolutely want to have immigration at the 0 mark. But when you have such a large scale, of course a lot of people are going to choose this. What I didn't like about it is the fact that Manny was immediately, without even talking to somebody about what their concerns would be, why they want such lower immigration than our current levels, is immediately chalking them up to bigotry. Now, I've been many times on this show here, I have talked about immigration and how I want lower immigration levels and the problems with immigration, because this is one of the big deciders in our time that I find is necessary to have a conversation about. We've had such large immigration levels for so long, we're starting to see the negative consequences of that. And these can range in a lot of different ways that I'm going to get into. Now, when Manny says this also comes on the heels of what was said by the conservative immigration critic Michelle Rempel, and this is what I ended up doing in a video just a couple days ago, where she ended up saying that if you are anti-immigrant or anti-immigration or racist, that you have no part in the Conservative Party. There's no area in the Conservative Party movement for you. Now, the thing is that there's plenty of conversations that need to be had about immigration, but both what Manny says and also what Michelle Rempel says immediately shuts down that debate. And as it stands right now, as far as I know, I would have to go back to double check for sure, but as I understand it, Andrew Scheer isn't really against the immigration levels that Justin Trudeau is bringing in of about 300,000 per year. And at best, as we know so far, until there is an official release of the Conservative platform leading into the next election where they discuss immigration, they at least want the 250,000 immigrants per year. Now, as I reported probably about a year ago, I didn't break the story, I just reported on it, was the fact that this was an unpopular number. And this is actually something before my previous Twitter account was taken down. This is something that I ended up saying to Manny Ottawa himself. It wasn't a long Twitter exchange. It was only a couple tweets back and forth. But he ended up bringing up he was laughing at some PPC member because he was talking to the PPC member was talking about immigration. They talked about how Max wanted 250,000 immigrants every year. And then I kind of jumped in to explain that this has actually been reported on, and studies have been done that most Canadians said that they're pro-immigration, but that number drops significantly once you tell them that you're bringing in 250,000 every single year, and that most people wanted lower numbers. They also, when they found out that it was 250,000 every year, but it had been this way for years upon years, then their support for immigration dropped, and most people thought it was around 100,000 every single year. And then he kind of just made some fake sarcastic comment to me about, because at the time this was when I was more on the Max train, so he ended up making a comment about that. And as I said back to him, it has nothing to do with CPC or PPC. It has to do with it's not a popular number. Now, they are trying to shut down any sort of conversation into immigration. So we can't have a conversation about how the current healthcare field, about how it's already overburdened, and bringing in more immigrants is just going to make that worse. We can't talk about how many of the immigrants end up on the welfare system. We can't talk about how many immigrants end up becoming a net negative impact on the economy. We can't have a conversation about the money that governments end up giving out to the immigrants, such as the $50,000 that was given out to every family of Syrians that ended up coming to Canada. We had about 50,000 Syrians that showed up. We were giving out checks for $50,000 each. We can't talk about how in Toronto the homeless shelters are at max capacity, and that about 50% or more now are people who are immigrants. So literally the homeless Canadian citizens don't have a place to go anymore. We can't have a conversation about how Mayor John Tory was asking people last year to open up their homes and let people come stay with them. But that wasn't a real story, and I've also talked about that on this show as well. So we can't have any of these conversations. We also can't talk about how right now, all the illegal border crossers, we can't talk about how they are living out of 2 or 3 hotels, and the government is even considering buying those hotels simply because these people have nowhere else to stay, which is another net negative on the economy. How much these border crossers are costing us now. The only thing about the border crossers is I know that Manny himself is not happy with the current situation with the border crossers, that he's worked more on a conversation about legal immigrants more than anything else. So maybe I can cut him some slack there, but the point is even when we're talking about the illegal border crossers, a lot of what we've already said still applies. We can't talk about the rise in crime that has ended up happening here. We can't talk about how in the UK they currently have Indian and Pakistani and Arab rape gangs that are going around. We can't talk about how we have these small little ghettos that are forming inside our country. We can't talk about the division amongst all the different racial and religious lines. We can't have a conversation about integration simply because now you're a bigot or a racist because of it. We can't talk about the changing in demographics that are happening simply because now you're a bigot. And the thing is, too, is this is the sort of thing that I would expect better from somebody who is supposed to be a lifelong conservative who has constantly talked about how Justin Trudeau and the Liberals throw out these sort of insults all the time against people that they don't like, and here he is turning around doing the exact same thing over and over again against someone like Bill Tufts and everybody else who falls on this train, who has concerns about immigration simply because he doesn't agree with the current numbers. He wants 275,000 every year. Now, Manny is an immigrant. He's a Canadian citizen now. He got his Canadian citizenship a few decades ago. I think it was back in like the 80s or something like that. So he's been a Canadian for some time. But he's also trying to suggest as if these sort of people are then being bigoted towards him. He made some reference about how people told him to go back to, I think it was Italy is where he's from. I'm not so sure about this, but he's playing with the same game that Justin Trudeau does, where he tries to make, when it's in his favor, he tries and makes Canada seem like it's some racist, bigoted place, rather than we're starting to see the problems of this immigration that we're having, this mass immigration. And even the demographic changes that we're having are important to bring up. Now we have, most of our immigrants right now are coming over from the Middle East. And when they're coming over, they're bringing a lot of their religious beliefs with them. And along with this comes all sorts of intolerance, things that are not compatible with Western civilization. But we can't have this conversation according to Manny. I mean, just recently in the States, I believe it was, we just heard about how there were all these Islamic kids that were talking about how they will singing a song about, I believe, something along the lines of cutting the heads off of the infidel, and they're going to fight them. This is exactly the problem that we're having with the immigration that we're talking about. And it's just, in his eyes, if you don't agree with these large numbers, then you're a bigot. And the other thing is, too, is when we're talking about 250,000, 300,000 every single year, now we're getting pretty damn close to how many children we have here in Canada every single year. The number is between 300,000 and 450,000 kids born every single year in Canada, at least over the last few years. And so that means we're almost bringing in the same amount of numbers, or a good 75% of people, as we're having babies here in Canada. When we can also even talk about how the Canadian government has recently made changes to the child benefit plan, and the child benefit plan is going to give more money. Who's that really going to benefit? Is it going to be the Canadian family who is born here, who has what, maybe two kids, maybe three at most? Anymore, and that's just seen as a very large family in Canada these days? Or is it going to be for the new immigrant, new arrival, who comes in from some of these areas and ends up having large amounts of children, comes in, has 4, 5, 6, or 7 children? Who's really going to benefit the most out of this, coming from taxpayer dollars? But you can't have this conversation. We can look to what's going on in Europe right now to show us that we can't just keep bringing in large numbers like this. Right now in France and Germany and Sweden and the UK, they're seeing the problems of mass migration, and we're starting to see those here in Canada. We need to cut off the tap before we actually get into a situation that we can't come back from. But in Manny's eyes, if you're not supporting 250,000 people at least every single year, well, you're just a bigot. And he says he wants to have this conversation, but then he goes out of his way to immediately shut down the conversation before it's even begun. I just think it's absolutely ridiculous. I think it's a terrible idea. And for a guy who sits there and tries to act like he is pro free speech, he's willing to shut down a debate before it's even begun. He's willing to silence somebody and not let them speak, and he may not be telling them to shut up, but he's using the tactics of the left against other people on the right. People, the PPC and the CPC may not agree with each other. They may not agree with each other, but when they start going at each other and using the tactics of the enemy, the tactics of the other side, then you're proving to be no better than the people that you criticize, no better than Justin Trudeau and his Liberal Party and his liberal supporters.